Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Observer Research Foundation this afternoon. It's great to see so many of you here for a very interesting topic and interaction, and a very unique topic and interaction, may I add. And of course, Bangladesh is a significant point of debate in South Asia's geopolitics. It's something that we study keenly as part of our research at the Observer Research Foundation. And it's great to have Mr. Clifford Smith today to talk about Bangladesh, to talk about US-Bangladesh relations, to talk about the Jamaat-E-Islami, and how these dynamics are both playing out from a regional perspective here and from an international perspective as far as the view from DC is concerned. So very quickly, Mr. Clifford Smith is director of Washington Project at the Middle East Forum in Washington. He has a very illustrious background in policy, in politics, and in international relations. He's also served with congressmen on the Capitol Hill, and has written extensively across the American media landscape. So without any further delays, may I just hand over the mic to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, your stage, please.
Thank you very much to the Observer Research Foundation for having me. I have long been interested in the Indian subcontinent, India as a country. But it's only been in the past few years that I have been able to work directly on some issues related to the South Asia region. And it's only been this year that I've ever been able to travel to India. This is my second time here in a year, and I hope I get to come back. I love this country. I believe that the future of our two great countries are intertwined, and I hope we will both be better off with a close relationship. So anyway, as he said, I work for the Middle East Forum as its Washington project director, and previously I worked as a congressional staffer, a few other things, a lawyer for a small nonprofit, a couple of campaigns. In short, I am a political and policy professional who also dabbles in a little bit deeper thinking. What this means is, while I have a much better than average for a DC staffer, DC operative, understanding of South Asia, South Asian politics, Islam, radical Islam, movements with Islam, international relations, and other topics, I want to stress that, I'm not a deep expert in all these things. My experience is more practical. For years now, I have been working to curb the influence of the Jamaat-E-Islami lobby in the US on questions of South Asia. This started about 5 years ago. My colleague Sam Westrop was from the UK before he moved to America. And in the UK, Jamaat-E-Islami is very powerful among the South Asia diaspora. And when he moved to the US, he noticed something that almost nobody else realized, that some of these same actors, not quite on the same scale, but were very involved in the same kinds of questions and doing the same kinds of things they were doing in the US. And he started writing a series of groundbreaking articles about it. And that was what started my activism in this and working in DC on this issue. Long story short, in 2018, in the run-up to Bangladesh's election in that year, we realized that in 2014, Bangladesh's Jamaat-E-Islami student wing had been one of the most violent groups in the world in that year, essentially trying to intimidate their opponents, kill their way to power, and had done massive damage. And we didn't want it to happen again. We worked with very few other people in America that understood this issue to get a resolution introduced to counter this and to point out who these people were. And so in the run-up to the election, should this kind of thing happen again, to make sure people knew what was happening. Congressman and soon-to-be Senator Jim Banks introduced this resolution. It did what it was intended to do. It made a lot of headlines in Dhaka. And it also got him very openly attacked by Bangladeshi Jamaat, on Twitter and in other ways. And since then, I have worked very actively to continue this work, to call attention to this lobby, to what they are doing, both in America and abroad. So, having said that, let me tell a joke that I think frequently that reveals a sad truth. To most Americans, Bangladesh is not a place, it's a concert that George Harrison and Ravi Shankar put on in 1971. My point is that they have very little conception of what goes on in South Asia. This is true even of fairly well-educated staffers in the US. They think, or they believe they know, have an idea of what goes on with the Israel-Palestinian dispute. They think they know something about Egypt or about certainly European politics, Russia, Latin America, even China. They know very little about South Asia. The point is, South Asia, when it comes to South Asia more generally, or Bangladesh more specifically, most Americans know very little. As such, when someone comes to them with a story or a point of view, even if it's well outside the mainstream, even if it holds very little resemblance to reality, they're inclined to believe it simply because they know very little else about it. There are, of course, exceptions. There are true experts in the region and all that kind of stuff, but they're not the majority. They're not even close to it. And that it's not in the ethos the way the Middle East or Europe or some of these other bigger questions is, which goes back to Jamaat-E-Islami. You probably know Jamaat-E-Islami as Madhudi's Islamist network founded before India's partition, which was very active in both East and West Pakistan before they were split into Pakistan and Bangladesh. And you probably know that they were perpetrators of the Bengali genocide in 1971. But Jamaat-E-Islami did not stay in South Asia. It exists globally, including in the US and in Europe. To me, most predominantly, although not exclusively, it is the Islamic Circle of North America, or ICNA, as it's usually called. There are other organizations, the Muslim Ummah of North America, and various subchapters of these groups, such as Helping Hands for Relief and Development, ICNA Relief, and others. This is just in America. There are more in Europe. ICNA is simply a branch of Jamaat-E-Islami, a major one. This is not seriously disputed by anybody that knows the region or knows the topic at all. Madhudi himself visited their opening event in the late 70s. They refer to themselves as admirers of his philosophy in their own literature. And scholars on this topic, including people that are not necessarily along my ideological or religious lines, Vali Nasser, a Shia Muslim that is widely considered a man of the left, wrote probably the authoritative book on Jamaat-E-Islami in English, and he openly refers to ICNA as one of the major branches of Jamaat-E-Islami in the world. John Esposito, a prominent academic from Georgetown, also refers to Islamic Circle of North America as a Jamaat proxy. The only time this is challenged is in a highly technical sense when ICNA finds itself in trouble for being too close to terrorists, and they try to, get away from things that they otherwise would be close to. But nobody seriously disputes this. ICNA, or Islamic Circle of North America again, is known to be closer to the Pakistani branch of Jamaat-E-Islami, but that is not a hard and fast rule, and they get involved in Bangladeshi politics as well. And also, Ashraf Fuzaman Khan, a leader in Jamaat-E-Islami militia group in Bangladesh, who was convicted and sentenced to death by a war crimes tribunal in Bangladesh, is the former ICNA vice president. After this happened, he is believed to move out of the US. Last I heard, he's living in Pakistan. But the point is, a very high-ranking officer in ICNA was a Bangladeshi war criminal. There are other things that show how clearly their interests align with Bangladeshi Jamaat. When Mukhtar Rahman Nizami, another convicted Bangladeshi war criminal, was sentenced to death for leading the Al-Badr terror squad, current president of Islamic Circle of North America, who was also their former chairman of two of their other branches, as well as a leader in other Islamist organizations, a guy by the name of Mohsen Ansari, a Pakistani origin doctor, openly mourned for him on his social media accounts, and Islamic Circle of North America gave him a posthumous Community Appreciation Award after he was executed, to show you where they are going. Another person that mourned Nizami's passing was Turkish President Erdogan, who tried very hard and very openly to prevent his execution. More on that later. Another organization that I mentioned that is trying to shape Americans' perception of Bangladesh and of events in South Asia is a group called the Muslim Ummah of North America, or MUNA, as I mentioned. Mohammed Nakdur Rahman is a prominent board member and spokesperson for MUNA, and the close friend of Mohsen Ansari, the Islamic Circle of North America's current president. He is the son of a war criminal in Bangladesh. Where am I going with this? My point being is that these groups exist. They are active, they have many chapters, they are well organized, and have every incentive to paint the Bangladeshi government, the Awami League, and Jamaat-E-Islami in Bangladesh in a particular way. Generally, the way they view these things is not how I think is in the best interest of my government and my country, and not in the best interest of the people of Bangladesh either. They have every incentive to amplify the sins, real or imagined, of the Bangladeshi government and the Awami League and Sheikh Hasina. They have every incentive to downplay the role of Islami Chakra Shabir for their violence in 2014, but in the lead up to the election. They do so. What's more, they are not acting alone. Bangladesh Jamaat acts independently as well as in concert. A London-based barrister, Abdur Razak, before resigning for Jamaat-E-Islami, visited DC frequently to make the case for Bangladeshi Jamaat, to go after the government. More recently, another London-based lawyer named Toby Cadman, who is registered as Jamaat-E-Islami Bangladesh's lawyer, has been active in doing the same thing. He just recently, a few days ago, put out a statement decrying the Bangladeshi government for keeping Jamaat-E-Islami from contesting elections, saying that it was driven by the need to repress anything seen as political dissent. And I could go on and on. There is a huge ecosystem in the US, both from domestic Islamists as well as Bangladeshi, projecting their power directly into the US via lobbying and such, to shape the narrative in a certain way. At times, this has significant effects. I will never forget a time when I had just started working on these issues. I attended a briefing on Capitol Hill in the House of Representatives office building on Bangladesh. Human Rights Watch, a left-wing NGO, was in attendance, and John Sifton, Human Rights Watch Director for Asian Advocacy, openly criticized Bangladesh for banning what he called the Jamaat Party, an act he deemed undemocratic. No context whatsoever was provided for this. Knowing a little bit about the history of Jamaat-E-Islami, I was shocked. I fully understand the inherent difficulties and risks in disqualifying political parties from participating in the process. Making democracy work is difficult, and there's always a risk that a ruling party will come up with some pretext to disqualify legitimate opposition. But there's widespread agreement that there must also be a bright line between parties that participate in the democratic process peacefully and those that use violence. An actor in the so-called democratic process that does not hesitate to get involved in violence is not dedicated to democracy. And to have an influential organization like Human Rights Watch that cannot even be bothered to mention that the Jamaat Party, in their words, was part of a genocide that literally killed millions and had engaged in mass violence only a few years ago, and not even bothered to bring this up as a context, I knew something had gone deeply wrong. And it has. And that is, I think, some of the source of problems with US policy towards Bangladesh and the wider South Asian region. Let me take a step back now and talk about the wider issue of Islam in America. Islam in America is not new. It is hundreds of years old. Currently, there are an estimated 3.45 million Muslims in America, or about 1.1% of the population. It is roughly tied for third after Christianity and Judaism, roughly tied with Hinduism and Buddhism. And the vast majority of these Muslims have no political agenda significantly different from Christian, Hindus, Buddhists, or any other of their fellow Americans. Most do not get involved in politics beyond voting. However, it is simply accurate to note that the most involved and most organized Muslims tend to be Islamists. Groups like ICNA are a prime example. When I say Islamists, I mean a Muslim who believes that Islamic law, as they conceive of it, should be imposed on everyone, regardless of religion, by the state, and that they take actions to make that happen. That can be done peacefully or through violent means. My organization believes that Islamism, certainly in its modern form, is a relatively new phenomenon, started in the early 1900s, around the same time as communism, fascism, and other radical ideologies that have plagued the past 100 years. We distinguish this from Islam itself. We view Islam as a religion not that different from others. Well, Islamism, which is unique to Muslims but is not all of Islam, is a threat not only to non-Muslims but to the majority of moderate Muslims. Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood is probably the most prominent example of a modern Islamist movement and organization. And of course, Muslim Brotherhood thinkers were in close touch with Maududi when he started Jamaat-E-Islami. I'm bringing this up to say that for decades, this issue was simply not something that registered to America. Our Muslims are overwhelmingly peaceful, and particularly during the Cold War in the Soviet Union, Islamists at home and abroad were frankly on the US's side, generally speaking. That came to bite us after 9/11. Since then, the issue has become much more discussed, but also much more politicized and much more polarized. Some thought the government failed to identify Islamism as a threat. Others saw the focus on Islamism in the aftermath of 9/11 as unjustly targeting peaceful Muslim communities. And the polarization that resulted in that has created political divisions in the United States ever since. It would be beyond the scope of this talk to discuss all the ways this has happened, but briefly let me say that former President Obama made this issue worse, in my view, by giving Islamist organizations and some prominent Islamists a louder voice in his government and his administration. Former President Trump also made the problem worse by unfairly blaming Islam writ large, his famous Muslim ban speech being a good example. And yet, even having said that, there is a deep irony. While the Obama administration gave Islamists legitimacy, and the Trump administration, I would argue, largely unfairly attacked the Muslim community in a larger sense, the Trump administration also funded, through the federal government, Islamist organizations to a far greater degree than the Obama administration did. We have been very active as an organization at the Middle East Forum in documenting this, although frankly, few want to look at the data. It doesn't fit the narrative. But this makes the problem worse. What I'm getting at here now is that Islamism as an idea, as a radical ideology, is not limited to Jamaat-E-Islami proxies, it is a larger issue, and it infects our politics in different ways. There are other groups that are not linked to Jamaat-E-Islami that are very active on some of these questions. A Muslim Brotherhood run group, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is a prominent example. There are Turkish origin groups, even the sympathizers of Wahhabism or Deobandi ideologies, and these groups all work together. Here's just one example. In June of this year, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Islamic Circle of North America, the Muslim Ummah of North America, the Indian American Muslim Council, the Muslim American Society, and the Islamic Society of Greater Houston staged a protest in Houston against India's human rights abuses. Another useful example. Last month, there was an annual Muslim Hill Day in Washington, where various Muslim groups got together to lobby Congress. In and of itself, it's fine, but who were these people? They were hosted by the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, or the USCMO. This is an umbrella organization, and this umbrella organization included ICNA, CARE, MUNA, and several other organizations. This is the 8th year this event happened. This latter example is particularly interesting as that it was hosted, at least in past years, by the Turkish American Community Center. Again, sounds innocuous. What is the Turkish American Community Center? The Turkish American Community Center is a mosque just a few miles outside of Washington, D.C., that is part of the official arm of the Turkish government, the Diyanet. The Diyanet was originally founded to moderate religious services under Ataturk. Under President Erdogan, it has taken a somewhat different turn. And the USCMO is actually a Turkish origin organization that has sought to consolidate these various Islamist lobbies. Moreover, Mohsen Ansari, who I mentioned a little while ago, was president of Jamaat-E-Islami's largest US organization, the Islamic Circle of North America, is also the chairman of USCMO. Right after Erdogan took up the Pakistani side of the Kashmir dispute at the UN in 2021, he immediately departed for a meeting with others. The head of this meeting was Mohsen Ansari and the USCMO. Senior Erdogan aides have openly said on record that they view Jamaat-E-Islami and Muslim Brotherhood groups as soft proxies for the Turkish government. This is not even getting into the Pakistani lobby, which of course works very closely with the Islamic Circle of North America, other Islamist groups, indirectly and sometimes even directly on the issue of Bangladesh. I could tell an even longer story of how that works, but let me put it briefly of just how incestuous some of this lobbying is. The Association of Physicians of Pakistani Descent of North America seems innocuous enough. It is a collection of Pakistani doctors. However, they are wealthy, they are very influential, they have a political action committee that funds candidates, and they are pretty openly a supporter of various Jamaat-E-Islami franchises in America. And they have been very close to Imran Khan, to current minister Sharif, and to President Erdogan. Just recently, within the past month, Erdogan had a video message at their event, as did the Pakistani Prime Minister. The Turkish ambassador also spoke, saying, "We are eager to further our collaboration between Turkish Americans and Pakistani Americans and exploring additional venues for cooperation." The picture I'm painting for you is messy in detail, but the overall picture is simple. Islamists of various stripes are organized. They work together, and they lobby against their perceived enemies together, and they are often supported by foreign states. It is very difficult to know the full impact of this activity. It is even more difficult to know with certainty just how much this affects the US view of Bangladesh specifically. But it obviously has an impact, if for no other reason, that the opposition at the grassroots level, particularly until very recently, was non-existent, and now it is only just budding. Here's a real-world example. I'm gonna be a little bit vague because this was told to me in confidence, but a member of Congress supported legislation that hurt the interests of Jamaat-E-Islami Bangladesh. He got a smattering of letters thanking him for this organization, mostly from Hindus or from moderate Bangladeshi Muslims, which are the majority of American Bangladeshis. He also got over 500 letters delivered to his office condemning him for introducing this bill, and he was attacked on social media by Jamaat-E-Islami activists. And if you were to just look at the feedback he got, you would have thought that opposition to criticizing Jamaat's crimes was overwhelming and support was tepid. Of course, the opposite is true. Most Bangladeshis, most South Asians, I think of most stripes, have no sympathy for this kind of thing. But that's not the impression, and that's intentional. They want to create the impression that anybody that criticizes radical Islamist, Jamaat-E-Islami, or that is supportive of the Bangladeshi government, for example, is all actually going after American Muslims writ large, that they are Islamophobic, that they hate or fear Muslims. This is a powerful idea, particularly in the US, where bigotry is a very real concern by the public at large. They are opposed to it and they want to live in peace with their neighbors of all stripes. However, this concept is weaponized by Islamists who attack anyone who opposes their goals. There, of course, are people who hate or irrationally fear Muslims. There have been horrible attacks on Muslims, which one should not deny this. The Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, for a perfect example. But as applied, it is almost always to attack those who criticize radicals, and even governments that are majority Muslim, Bangladesh, UAE, are often accused of Islamophobia. Absent effective opposition, this narrative often works. It certainly works far more often than it ought to. And currently, the opposition in South Asia lacks the scale of the Islamist lobby. And it's not just organizations that are weaponizing this narrative. Turkey, Pakistan, Qatar, bizarrely even China, routinely accuse the US and its allies, or any of its foes, of being Islamophobic if it suits their needs. It's really funny to me, China using this. By any rational definition, China, with what it's doing to the Uyghurs, would be the most Islamophobic country on the planet. But that's not the point. The point is not a good faith effort to give the fair shake to the many Muslims in the world. It's to demonize opposition. It is thus very easy for Jamaat-E-Islami and its friends and supporters to portray themselves as a beleaguered minority. And this, I think, is a big part of what has shaped, shall we say, unfortunate policies or misguided ways of looking at South Asia and Bangladesh in particular. And let's be honest, Bangladesh is an imperfect young democracy. It has struggled to become a democracy in the sense that we would like it to be. There's no doubt, I don't think, that reasonable people can find excesses by the ruling government. Any dominant political party can get swept up in the desire for power above all and create bad results. I'm an American. I have watched this happen in my own town just a few miles from my house in January 6, 2021. And there's reason to fear that this kind of thing could happen in Bangladesh. I know one observer in Bangladesh, in the State Department, that is sympathetic to the Awami League and the current government, that said he thought the 2018 election, in his words, was overcooked, meaning that, in his view, the Awami League had clearly and legitimately won, but that there had been shenanigans, for lack of a better word, from some of its supporters. My point in saying this is not to demonize the Bangladeshi government, nor the Awami League, nor Sheikh Hasina, but to note that some of the concerns by people in the State Department or around Washington are not totally irrational. My issue is to what degree ought this to drive US policy? This is the debate that is skewed by the Jamaat-E-Islami's activism and lobbying and the activism and lobbying of their friends. One of my favorite essays of all time is an essay called Dictatorships and Double Standards, written by Janine Kirkpatrick in the late 70s. In it, she accuses the Carter administration of undermining moderate autocrats friendly to American interests with less friendly autocrats that are more extreme. In other words, all countries fail to live up to a perfect democratic ideal, and a majority are not even democratic. So the best is to figure out what to do, relatively speaking. In my view, a violent theocratic movement like Jamaat-E-Islami is not be seen as a legitimate political party, particularly not when they are engaging in mass violence just a few years ago. But the entire Jamaat-E-Islami lobby in the US and their supporters is aimed at flipping that perception. By painting the Awami League's excesses as equal or worse than that of Jamaat, they aim to refocus the debate. US's decision in late 21 to apply sanctions to the Rapid Action Battalion, or RAB, in Bangladesh is a perfect example of what I'm speaking of. As I'm sure you know, RAB was founded by the BNP, Jamaat-E-Islami's now partner, and was in power, and was widely popular due to problems with the usual Bangladeshi police, as well as the urgency of fighting terrorism. They were invited to train in the US and the UK, and the Biden administration's decision to sanction them was, in the words of Ali Riaz of the Atlantic Council, unprecedented. It was done in the name of fighting authoritarianism. Senators that had asked for sanctions against RAB didn't even ask him to go as far as he actually did. But it's worth noting that it was reports by Human Rights Watch, the same organization that could not be bothered to mention that Jamaat-E-Islami was a key player in the Bengali genocide in 1971. They were one of the groups shaping the narrative around RAB, and a key part of painting them as being worthy of sanction. I lack the expertise and, frankly, the intelligence to know the depths of the problems, and in terms of what the intelligence community would know about the depths of the problems with RAB. Elite police forces can be abused, and I find it plausible they have been. However, what concerns me is the lack of focus on Jamaat-E-Islami and their terrorist arms and their terrorist friends. At minimum, the US policy should take those equally into concern. If they have done so, I have seen little evidence of it. And I've seen a lot to indicate they focused almost exclusively on the real or perceived misdeeds of the RAB, and not at all on the violence and radicalism of Jamaat-E-Islami and their allies. It seems to me much more steps could have been taken to understand the nuances and to have a more fair policy before going this. I would argue, for example, that placing sanctions on Pakistan's ISI would have made a lot more sense. They've gone far, 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 far worse, in my view, than RAB ever could, yet that's not even contemplated. The more recent visa restrictions in Bangladesh, in theory, apply to opposition actors, but in practice, they seem aimed solely at the Awami League. There's little indication such sanctions work to modify the behavior of the government. I don't think that the Biden administration is out to topple the Hasina government, but I do fear they are taking the side of the Islamists and will have negative ripple effects for both the US and Bangladesh. One not need to think that their concerns are totally legitimate to realize that they are functionally taking the side of the worst actors who present an even worse problem than some of the actors they seek to punish, with little awareness of this fact. It is not in the best interest of the US or democracy rightly understood to empower elements that clearly have no interest in real democracy, except perhaps as a means for gaining power by which they will ensure to maintain power perpetually. Jamaat-E-Islami is such an actor, in my view, and US policy, as driven by domestic Jamaat-E-Islami actors and their friends and fellow travelers, fail to recognize this problem. And I think that's a problem for both of our countries. Again, I don't feel that US policies are by and large drawn out of malice. I believe they are instead born out of mistaken impressions and an aggressive effort to paint a particular narrative without the full facts. To the degree our Indian and Bangladeshi partners can provide a more complete picture and call attention to why certain facets are being overlooked, AKA the Jamaat-E-Islami lobby and their friends, while acknowledging the legitimate concerns of those in government, I think the US can chart a better policy for itself and for the South Asia region. Thank you very much. I'm glad to take any of your questions.
Thanks, Cliff, for a very extensive and interesting presentation. So we do have about 20 minutes for a Q&A. Please keep your, of course, I invite everyone to pose as many questions as possible to Cliff, but please keep your questions short and introduce yourself first. I'll just come to you. I'll take the opportunity of being the moderator to ask the first question, and then I'll just come to the floor. It'd be very interesting to just start off with some of the things that you said, like right at the end, of how sort of all this sort of feeds into a more sort of localized democratic system in the US as well when it comes to electoral politics. What kind of, since you spent time on the Hill and you spent time around decision making, what kind of policy imperatives are offered as responses when some of these groups or some of these influence zones are created as part of your political outreach? From one party or the next party.
And you're talking about in terms of when these groups come to political actors?
I mean, one that, but also when these groups do sort of present themselves as part of the political debate in the US.
Yeah.
But clearly, they're not seen as let's say quote unquote rational actors. So like, what kind of policy imperatives are offered as a response to this? Like, how does Washington look at let's say Jamaat-E-Islami's influence zones within the country?
I think they have almost no awareness of it whatsoever. I could name on one hand the amount of people that, certainly in Congress, that really understand who they're talking to half the time. And I think that there's more awareness in some of the security, but even that's messy. Again, I have to be a little bit cagey because it's a private conversation that I can't get into too much. But I mentioned in my talk that the Trump administration in particular funded a lot of these Islamist groups through various grant programs and such in the federal government to a astonishing degree. And while they were doing this, some of Islamic Circle of North America's biggest fundraisers were actually in jail for lying to the FBI as part of a terror finance investigation. I talked to some of the agents involved in that case personally. And I pointed out to them that while it was very public that they were prosecuting fundraisers for this group, I mean, this was on a Justice Department press release, the Homeland Security Department was funding this same group to a degree of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they got this, look in their eye, kind of rolling their eyes, going, "Yes, I know. There's nothing I can do about it. They're over in this bureau doing this thing, over in this other bureau doing something else." So, I mean, the people that were investigating the case, they understood that these Jamaat actors, for example, in this particular case, I guess should have gotten a little more, but some of their senior people have been involved in different levels of overt actions with Lashkar-e-Taiba, with Hizbul Mujahideen, with other terrorist groups, and have even gotten caught doing so. But yet at the same time, they're prosecuting some members while handing out money at the other. And again, that shows the level of just complete ignorance of many people inside even the bureaucracy that ought to know better. A few do. The ones that were investigating some of these crimes did. The ones that were making policy that was giving out grants to these same groups, they don't have no clue. Another conversation I had with a senior Senate aide a few years back, they were crafting legislation on counter-extremism. And they mentioned one of these groups that they were talking to about this legislation. And I said to them, "Well, you realize who these groups are, don't you? I mean, these are not just your average, Muslims at your mosque. These are organized, Islamists, with this such and such a background." I feel like I shouldn't get into specifics. They had no awareness of that. And I said, "Well, really, you ought to find someone else to talk to if you want to talk to the Muslims community." And he's like, "Well, but they came to talk to us, and we got to talk to somebody in the Muslim community. And this is what they're telling us they want. So, and that's the level of their understanding, frankly. I hate to say that, but that's true."
All right, thanks. Can I just start with Sushant sir first, and then we can go to the gentleman right at the end of the table.
Thanks, Kabir. So, Cliff, there are two questions where I'll start with the more important one. Is there no strategic thinking in the US government? And what I mean by that is, who do they identify as the enemy? In the sense that, do they think that radicalism or radical Islam is an inimical force, or do they think they can do business with it? Now, experience should have taught them that, yeah, Saddam Hussein was a really horrible man. But after 9/11, it made sense to support Saddam Hussein because he really had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. Same with Gaddafi. Same with MBS. He might have done something really rotten, but look at the kind of changes he's trying to bring about, which I would have thought would fit into, the kind of image that America wants around the world. And I say this because I link it with what's happening in Bangladesh. Now, you're right. Awami League is not a perfect government by by no stretch of imagination, huge problems in Bangladesh. And as a Hindu in India, I would say that yes, they've turned a blind eye to many of the depredations that have taken place against the Hindu community out there. And yet, if I have to put them up against the Jamaat-E-Islami and the BNP, I would say it's a no-brainer to support them.
Yeah. So
isn't there any thinking within the administrative level?
There is, and they have it backwards. That's the short version. Is what I would say is the British have done this very inconsistently, but a number of years ago, I think it was 2015, David Cameron made a speech in which he said, in essence, that the British government had been getting things wrong for the past 10 or 15 years. It had believed that moderate Islamists, basically non-violent Islamists, were a bulwark against violent Islamists, that, they could work with the Muslim Brotherhood or Jamaat-E-Islami in order to head off Al-Qaeda or ISIS or these different groups. And he said they've been getting it wrong, and that the thing they now realized, which they have not consistently applied since, but they now realize that this sort of Islamist theocratic thinking not only was a conveyor belt to violence, to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, to different terrorist groups, but that it was also not representative of the majority of British Muslims. That was correct. He was right about that. That has not taken root in the US government. I don't think it's taken root in the British government either, frankly. But the idea that there are these sort of peaceful, moderate Islamists that aren't a big deal, and then there are these violent ones that we don't like, that's still, I think, the majority thinking in the UK, in the US and the UK.
Any follow?
Very quickly, so that I can be...
Okay, just sentence. I think you'd be making a bigger mistake than the one you are making now if you were to listen to the Brits.
Yeah.
They messed up
and they continue to mess
with
up.
you in Afghanistan. They'll mess up with you all over the world.
Oh, I know, you're right.
I suggest just ignore them.
Oh, I do. The only reason I mentioned David Cameron was because he made, in this one speech, he did make this distinction. They're not doing a good job of implementing what he said. They've done a horrible job. But he at least acknowledged the problem that peaceful Islamism, radical Islamism, is not actually a bulwark against violence. It's actually a conveyor belt to it. That's what he was right about.
Right. So could I just come to you?
Kalol Bhattacharjee from The Hindu. My question is that you mentioned that some of the concerns of the State Department about Hasina government are not irrational. And it then went on to say that RAB hasn't been tough on Jamaat, or rather they haven't really done as much as they should have or they could have, and the visa restrictions. Could you please elaborate on why do you think is the State Department rational in its attitude towards Hasina government? And secondly, of course, there's been a talk about the strategic thinking, but do you also understand and appreciate that India's immediate security concerns are linked with Bangladesh's present government, and weakening of the government would actually expose India to very same challenges that you have been talking about?
Let me clarify that a little bit. What I mean by that is not that I agree with their policy or their thrust of their policy. What I mean by that is I think it is all well and good to encourage democracy in the best sense of the word, and I think that's a good foreign policy item for the US and for India and for any other country to encourage. And I do think there have been problems with the current government in Bangladesh. So when I say it's not irrational, what I mean is those kinds of concerns are not irrational. That does not mean, however, that I think that it is therefore rational or smart to support the agenda of Jamaat-E-Islami simply because of the excesses or problems of the Hasina government. That I do not think is a good policy. I do not think it is what the State Department ought to be pursuing, which it seems to be doing.
All right. Could I come to you, sir, first?
Hi, I'm Shafat Yusuf. I work as a teaching assistant at the University of Manchester, UK. Yeah, my question actually has two parts, very briefly. One is when we talk about this specific Jamaat-Islami problem. Okay, so I would continue Sushant's question. What kind of solution in the short term and in the long term is in the thinking in Washington regarding this particular problem. And other thing is this problem originates from the ideology of political Islam.
Sure.
And political Islam is a reality.
Yes.
Okay, it is now emerging as a, for example, as a phenomena of Taliban in Afghanistan. So it's not going backwards; it's going forwards.
Yeah.
So as a long-term strategy to contain this problem and also to understand its implications as an ideology, political Islam, what sort of thinking is going on in Washington? Yeah, thank you.
The short answer is very little. I think that, how should I put this? My main job in DC is to work with people in Congress and the State Department, Homeland Security, other think tanks, what have you, to bring greater awareness to these kinds of problems, not just political Islam, but that's a big chunk of it. And getting people in Washington to pay attention to this problem at all, quite frankly, is very difficult right now. Right now, people are obsessed with China, they're obsessed with Russia and the Ukraine war, and frankly, for complicated reasons that frustrate the hell out of me, the way things in Iraq and Afghanistan went, particularly Afghanistan more recently, have kind of soured people. They just don't want to think about it. And frankly, if we were really thinking about this problem, I don't think Afghanistan would have, I don't think the fall of Kabul would have happened, certainly, and so we're just not thinking about it. And I think it's going to come back to bite us.
Hi, I'm Shireen. I'm an entrepreneur. So my apologies if my question sounds silly. I'm really sorry for that. So the thing is, I don't know what Jamaat-E-Islami was doing in Bangladesh, is doing actually. So is it creating some kind of civil unrest, killing minorities, or creating kind of putting people behind jails, journalists?
I think, like a lot of Islamist political movements, the violence in Jamaat-E-Islami, they're smart about it, relatively speaking anyway. They use it when they have to. They don't use it when they don't have to. I mean, they definitely use it in targeted places and people, even in recent years. But on a mass scale, it hasn't happened for a few years. 2014 is probably the last time it happened on a big scale. And that's partially due to the Hasina government cracking down on it. But the point is they do those kinds of things when they feel they need to, when they think it's in their best interest, and they stop when they don't need to, and they portray themselves as victims when they don't need to. And I think that is what they do across the board. I think that's what they do in Bangladesh. I think that's what they do in Pakistan. I think that's what they do in Kashmir. I think that's what they do in the US.
So they did in 2014 this kind of civil unrest.
Sure,
and they killed minorities there?
I mean, most against Hindus was a lot of it. I believe Jane's Guide to Terrorism and Insurgency named them the third most violent non-state actor in 2014. And then they faded off the books, partially because of the actions of the Hasina government and partially due to the fact they needed to lay low. But the point is, they're clearly not shy about doing it, and they'll do it again. And there's even been a lot of flare-ups. I can't get into the specifics, but I mean, they've seemed to have formed different groups under different names in Bangladesh to do attacks when they need to and claim it wasn't them. I mean, there's always these kinds of games going on with movements like this.
So the same thing in continuation is happening in India also. Since 2014, we are seeing a lot of things, planned actions against minorities. We see every day riots and all the things, and it's happening everywhere, every day.
Sure.
So what do you say about this? Is it not a concern for you?
It's a huge concern for me.
Because Bangladesh is pretty tiny country, and we are very huge. We are huge here.
Yes. No, I know, and again, as I discussed in my talk, I think my government's going in a very bad place on some of this. I was just 4 months ago. I was just in Kashmir talking to Kashmiri pandits and talking about the threats they face on a daily basis. I talk to Bangladeshis that are afraid of Jamaat-E-Islami in their own country fairly frequently. I know it's
not even minorities, even Muslims also. They are afraid of them.
Of course.
Yes, it's not about religion. It's about the outfit, what they are working for.
Of course.
Thank you so much for your talk. Firstly, Mr. Smith, I'm Colonel Advitiya Kathuria. I'm here in an independent capacity, firstly. Let me clarify that. My question pertains to the facts that you stated about interorganizational cooperation between various entities, which are all linked to the Jamaat-E-Islami.
Sure.
Now,
Not all, but I mean that.
Quite a few of
the
them.
Islamist milieu.
Yes, quite a few of them. So usually when such a thing happens, it inevitably means that there is a central leadership, a thread of leadership that is coordinating at the highest levels and planning at the highest levels, usually in a situation like this. It's not just mere coordination amongst different organizations out of the blue or at the peripherals.
Yeah.
Right? So firstly, have you identified that what this thread or who are the major players in this thread of leadership, number one? And as a secondary question to that, is this thread of leadership in any way, have you found out any deeper links between the Chinese government and these threads? You made a brief statement to that effect, but is there any more information on that? Thank you.
Let me think. I think there's two things. I do think, to a certain degree, it depends what you mean by sort of high level direction and such. I mean, I don't think you necessarily need some sort of central mastermind for a bunch of people that have roughly the same ideology and think about the world in roughly the same way to work together. I mean, you don't need, this is just, an American example, you don't need a whole lot to get the Michigan Republican Party and the Minnesota Republican Party to see things the same way, because they're both Republicans, they're both roughly pushing for the same thing. So I think it's a mistake to think that you need too high level of coordination. I think that ideological similarities, I mean, the ideological similarities between Jamaat-E-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood are striking. I mean, they're almost identical from an outsider's point of view anyway. And so you don't need a whole lot to get that done. That said, I definitely think, as I alluded to, that there are state actors at times pushing this. I think, and this is something I would not have said 20 years ago, I would not have even said this 10 years ago, but right now, I would argue, at least in terms of Sunni radicalism and Sunni Islamism, Turkey, Qatar, and Pakistan are probably the three biggest state purveyors. And this does not just go to their regions. We actually did a series of articles just a year or two ago. We got a large amount of leaked documents from the Eid charity of Qatar. And frankly, they were throwing tens of millions of dollars to radical groups all over the world. In the US, in Europe, in the Middle East, in South Asia, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, everywhere. And not all of it was going to bad groups, but a whole lot of it was. And that's just what we could get our fingers on across. There's a lot more. The Qataris are the bankroll for a lot of this. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that all these groups are funded solely, even mostly, by foreign actors, or that they're guided by them, but there's definitely some kind of interplay there. Another thing I'll mention, since you brought it up, I don't know if you guys ever heard the name of Ghulam Nabi Fai. Ghulam Nabi Fai was a Pakistani American that actually went to jail for smuggling millions of dollars to the ISI to different pro-Pakistan's view of Kashmir causes. And he went to jail for, I think 3 or 4 years, and he came back out and started doing the same thing. I mean, I have no proof that he is getting money from the ISI again, but he certainly hasn't stopped his activism. So there's definitely some level of state involvement. It's very difficult to know certain how much. The China issue is an interesting question. The short version is I can't give you much now. What I can tell you is that I have been struck by the fact that the Chinese have started using the Islamophobia card very publicly internationally. That's interesting to me. It's also worth noting, I believe it was in 2009, 2010, somewhere around then, China actually signed an MOU with Pakistan's Jamaat-E-Islami. The details weren't that, it wasn't that detailed, but essentially the MOU said, if you read between the lines, we'll support you so long as you don't say anything about a repression of the Uyghurs, which, kind of what you might suspect. So I have no hard proof of any sort of Chinese influence. You do see, particularly, when you see Pakistani and Bangladeshi Islamists, however, a lot of confluence of interests. So let's see what happens over the years. It's something we're going to be watching.
All right, yeah.
Just one very quick question. I'm Ashwin Ahmed from Strat News Global. I just want to ask, this current political polarization we're seeing, we're even starting to see divergences on issues like Ukraine. Is that going to affect foreign policy going forward, especially on issues like radical Islam or other issues which aren't, as much as you say on the radar?
I'd say it already has. I think it already, and it's worked in very odd ways, frankly, that are difficult to understand from the outside and even from the inside in America. Like I mentioned, I actually think that the polarization around this issue, I mentioned, again, the fact that the Trump administration actually funded some of these organizations through various grant-making programs to a greater degree than any administration before it, or since. The Biden administration hasn't done it on the same level. And this is the same guy who, had the famous Muslim ban speech and has said a lot of other very incendiary things. Why is this? It's counterintuitive, but it actually makes some level of sense. If you're going to come out here and kind of swing for the fences and go way too far in going after Muslims in a larger sense, you're going to have both political and even legal reasons. Some Muslim organization asks for a grant. If you don't give it to them, they can start attacking you for, you're just not giving us this grant because you're Islamophobe. And that can even play out legally in terms of discrimination laws and things like that. So my point is I already think that this is playing out in foreign policy. I think that it's been playing out for a long time, and I think it's going to continue to. And I think just in general, a senior staffer for a senator who I shouldn't name, but once told me that, 30 years ago, we said in America, politics stops at the water's edge. And he said that was always more aspirational than real, but it was a real aspiration. And he's like, now we have partisan countries. We have the Democrats want to go after Saudi, the Republicans want to go after Iran. Nobody wants to think in sort of a holistic term. You have partisan, client countries. It's insane from my way of thinking. But I think it's a reality in American politics right now. And I would love to say it's going to go away tomorrow, but I don't think it is.
All right, thanks a lot. We are really, really completely out of time. So I would just like to thank Cliff for taking the time out today for this very, very invigorating debate. And we have some refreshments across the hall, and we can continue our conversations there. So thanks everyone for making the time and coming today. Thank you.